It's good to see you all again. As you know, our Partners for a New Beginning has been working very hard trying to set up public-private partnerships, especially business, small business loans, and entrepreneurial help throughout the Muslim and Arab worlds. I guess the greatest book on this now is Chris Schroeder's book. I know this not only because I know Chris and respect him and have looked at the book, but because David Ignatius wrote such a good column about it that it made me think, well, if David says it's good, it must be good. So I think the best way we could get to talk about all this is to have the two players that made us all realize that this is the best way to understand entrepreneurship that is really remaking the Middle East, especially since Chris is not just like me, a writer, journalist. He actually has been a tech entrepreneur, so he knows what the field is like. I would urge all of you who want to get a little bit more familiar with Partners for a New Beginning, which is the group that we help as Secretariat. We help run here, but it was set up initially by Secretary Condi Rice as the U.S.-Palestinian partnership. Hillary decided to make it more broad and use the phrase Partners from a New Beginning, which is a phrase from Obama's Cairo speech. And now Secretary Kerry has had a couple meetings with our people. It is chaired by Madeleine Albright. I'm one of the co-chairs, but Mukhtar Kent. And is Chris a co-chair of Hilton? Not yet. All right, whatever. He is, okay. Well, talk to the people here who know more than I do to learn more about exactly who's running it. But I think it's a great way to get involved. There's probably, as Chris will say, a lot of skepticism among young entrepreneurs. And when people say that to me, it's perfectly understandable, but the only way to overcome any skepticism is actually to deliver year after year, month after month on small business loans, putting people together with things. So it's going to be very interesting to hear about this ecosystem. I'm a huge fan of both of these people, but also a very long-time friend of David Ignatius. So let me turn it over to David, please.
Great. Thank you. So, you said where you'd like to see it. So thank you to Walter. It's wonderful to be here. I should just note and salute all the good work that Walter does, both through the Aspen Institute, through his many other activities on issues that matter to all of us. I see a lot of friends in the audience, but I have a particular friend on my left. Given the number of things that I have done to speak up for this book, you would think I am getting kickbacks. And alas, I'm not, because Chris just told me it's going into a second printing, which for a serious book about business entrepreneurship in the Middle East is pretty darn good. I mean, that could roll into a second printing. It tells you that it really is a subject that people care about, want to know about, and also that it's a terrifically well-written and readable book. So I commend it to you if you haven't read it yet. I want to just say a few words about Chris, who is an old friend and colleague. We probably met about 15 years ago, when Chris was working for the Washington Post Company, now owned, as you know, Jeff Bezos's Washington Post Company. Back in the day, we worked for a fellow named Graham, and Chris ran several parts of our company, but he ran with real distinction our early efforts at online journalism, and left the Post after a number of years to form a company, Health Central, which has been very successful, and I believe you have now sold your interest in it, so Chris is now free to pursue philanthropic and other pursuits, such as writing this book. So it's really a pleasure to be able to do this with you, Chris. So I want to ask you to start, for people who haven't read the book, or to refresh the memories of people who have looked at it, just to tell us a couple of stories about your encounter with entrepreneurship in the Middle East. You got started in 2010. Just tell us about a couple of the companies or entrepreneurs that you met that form the kind of texture of the narrative that you're sharing here.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And let me just thank Walter, of course, as well for the extraordinary work that you do everywhere. I don't think Tony is here today, but PNB is really one of the, I would suggest, rare examples of public-private partnerships that really can make impact and does make impact on the ground. So I can't think of a better place I'd like to be here. I just would like to say that one caveat about the book and the book selling overall is your friend, actually, Rafe, who said to me when I first...
This is my agent, another of my...
Who's amazing man. And he
also not giving me kickbacks.
But there are no kickbacks to give, as I'll tell you in a second, because he was very funny, because when I first decided I was going to write a book about startups in the Middle East, he looked at me for 3 or 4 very long seconds and he said, "You really are an entrepreneur, you really are a contrarian, because there are only 2 books that never ever sell. Books on the Middle East and books about the internet. So congratulations for bringing them all together in one shot." And I should add, not as a pitch, as all authors do, that you please buy the book. I'm actually giving all of my proceeds away to an amazing social enterprise that is based now in Jordan, but rolling out throughout the Middle East, called Ruwad, which is a series of youth and community centers that's just having a profound impact in the poorest parts of the Middle East. So I encourage you, it's holiday season, give to Ruwad through my book if you can. But you know, David, in a lot of respects, this book is many things, but what it really is a journey in narrative bias. And in a way, it was my narrative bias that was most embarrassing of all, because I've traveled all over the world. I've run 3 technology-based media companies, all of which outsource technology to pretty much every corner of the world: Latin America, India, Israel, Sri Lanka, Eastern Europe for sure, Israel. I just simply could not get my mind around the idea that in that time, Mubarak's Egypt was kicking up anything that could resemble a technology ecosystem. It just was not something that I could get my mind around, even though it was happening in places that had had great challenge and great difficulty and great political unrest and instability. I just couldn't believe it. And through some of our mutual friends and some business folks that I know in the region, had started talking in about 2009 about this amazing thing that was happening bottom up. And they invited me to a gathering called the Celebration of Entrepreneurship in 2010. And my worldview was pretty much formed from before and after that event, because it was 2,400 young people with a 2,000 person waiting list. And you know, nobody wanted to talk about Obama's Cairo speech. Nobody cared about politics really at all. All they really wanted to do was talk about how could they build companies. Any of you who've been to great Silicon Valley or New York startup events, you would have felt completely at home. It was exactly the same thing. And they were building amazing technology at a high scale and very powerful. And there were 2 that sort of stood out at that event that really put me on the journey. They broke the conference down into these mentoring sessions, which means after people would gather in big rooms, you'd have these sub-rooms overall. And so they stuck me in a room where 6 or 7 young people would come in and just pitch their businesses, and then they would, you know, we would talk and to hopefully of some modicum of value to them overall. So I was talking to these 4 or 5 young men, including one fellow from Syria, and I start the book with this because to my left was like a cloud of black. I didn't really know what it was because I wanted to stay focused here, and I turned, and closer than you are to me was this young Saudi woman in full abaya, you know, with her shoulders back and her chin out and everything else. And she waited very patiently for her turn, and then finally described that she was building a business in Saudi Arabia that was effectively a elegant leather case with a battery, solar battery, charging so that women could carry their devices and have them charged at all times and all. And so I'm still trying to process the entire scene and give some, you know, baloney, top level, follow your dream kind of a thing. And you could just see her. I try to describe it in the book, but I can't do it justice. But she just becomes very bored, but very polite. And finally she said, "Well, thank you for that. That's really very nice. But here's the question I have for you." She said, "I've now been bidding with 3 different manufacturers of leather cases in China. They've all come into different areas with different prices, and they're very, very impressive. But I'm not sure they understand what the quality is of what we're trying to buy, and I'm not sure if I can communicate with them as fluently. It cost me $45,000 to buy a machine tool. I know 2 young women in Saudi who would be able to run this for me. But again, it's a trade-off of speed to market versus the quality I could manage. Cost is about the same. What should I do?" And I just looked at her and I said, "Well, I've got a problem with my company. And I'd like to ask you that question first because you're going to know more than I do." And it was just one story after this where the movement was very powerful. The second young man that stood out to me is a great entrepreneur who started pitching me an app development business. He had, at the time, the highest selling weather app in the world in the fairly nascent days. And as he was pitching it and describing it, I looked down at my iPad and I realized I had downloaded it 6 months earlier with no clue that it was 30 young people in Alexandria, Egypt who had built it. And now that app has over 6 million downloads, probably 52% of which are bought in the United States, and they're just off to the races.
Chris, just to give a word picture for people, just walk the audience through what you'd see you went to Flat 6 Labs in Giza with our friend Adli, yes? Alfie. You know, who's there? What kinds of businesses are they trying to pitch? What funding are they going to, and what success are they having?
So as this generation has access to unprecedented technology, which means that they can develop things in very powerful ways, and this could be low-end technology from just regular mobile phones, right? As many of you know, in most Arab countries, mobile penetration is well over 140 or 150%, which means people obviously have more than one phone, and there's lots of interesting innovation you can do with that. But the really big story, which I think will come down to, is that there's a great ubiquity of real full-blown broadband access to technology, both in terms of smartphone and regulars. And so while a lot is being done sort of bottom-up and in distance ways, there really is no substitution for people meeting and convening because it's so powerful. And so it should be no surprise that in the last 2 or 3 years that a series, Flat 6 Labs is one of the more exciting ones out of Cairo. In fact, Alfie's daughter is with us today because she is studying in Georgetown, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. But if you walked into an incubator, which is literally, it's a sort of a competition that chooses every 6 months or every 3 months companies that will come and they'll stay for a while, they'll get a little bit of money, they'll get access to broadband technology, they'll get access to mentorship, legal things, and everything else, and literally they get incubated and then they get spun out and they go build hopefully bigger, though some companies won't make it. But if you walked into them, it would be like walking into any great technology space anywhere in the United States. Here in Washington we have 1776, which if you haven't visited, you should visit it because there's a lot of ramifications both in terms of policy and business of what's going on. So it's wide open with desks and the computing is perfect, beautiful colors, open wide spaces, and everybody's head down doing things unless they're brainstorming about next ideas. There's a little theater where they'll go in and pitch ideas to each other or pitch ideas with investments. There's food available because they'll be there for 15 or 20 hours a day. And the thing that you probably get hit most with is just the energy of it. It's just people who are in motion and very excited about what they're doing.
I would second that, having made the trip to this Flat 6. It literally was Flat 6 in a building that was restored, and meeting some of these young people. And I should stress, these are not kids who were at Caltech and then came back to Cairo, or at GW and came back to Cairo. A lot of them are Cairo University graduates. They are really of the space, of the world that they're trying to start their businesses in. And the wonderful thing, it is a flat world, using the different meaning that if you're building apps for the iPhone, there's no reason you can't do it, start up on a shoestring in Cairo, and to hear these kids and their ideas, to hear how they're being coached in making good pitches to investors, to hear how, I'm forgetting, but at the time that I inquired about this, up to half of the initial classes that had gone through this incubator program had gotten funding for their businesses. I think that's right.
Yeah, it's absolutely right.
So it is so contrary to the mental snapshot that we have of Egypt today and over the last 2 years, that I think it's really important for people like Chris who've seen it and believed in it to share it with audiences like this, because it's real easy to be super depressed.
Yeah.
Chris, having said that, I want to ask you about, you wrote about entrepreneurs from Egypt, from Syria, from places that 2 years later, 2 years after you did most of your reporting, have really been shaken by the Arab revolutions. And I'd love to hear, you and I haven't talked about this really, but I'd love to hear your update about how it's going. Is it possible to keep building businesses in today's Egypt? Our friends, you and I have friends in Syria. I shudder to think what's happened to them.
Yeah, literally.
Give us an update about some of these young entrepreneurs and what's possible in the environment that exists now.
I think the first thing, just from a framing perspective, that's worthy of consideration is that and we'll talk about Syria very specifically, because to your point, two of the young entrepreneurs that I got to know were killed, and in Egypt this summer, in fact, his boss I knew, I only met this young man once, but he was also killed in Egypt there, and these are very, very real circumstances, right? This book is not a rah-rah book, and the story is not a hyperly optimistic thing in and of itself. There are two realities that are happening, I think, around emerging growth markets that are worthy of consideration. I mean, many of you know that the largest, in aggregate dollars, not in per capita dollars, the largest aggregate dollar mobile payment country on earth is Kenya. 20% of the entire GDP goes through a texting capability called M-Pesa, because it was a country that never had a banking system, and they sort of worked around this. And as you also can imagine, when you have something like that take off, really interesting things happen around it, which are also very exciting, and therefore investors are quite excited about Kenya. Kenya, of course, is the same country that 6 weeks ago, or whatever it was, had this unmitigated terrible attack. Any of you, and I can tell you my Silicon Valley friends who have tried to repatriate successfully capital from China have had a hell of a time there. India is in some very difficult political climates now. I know very successful startup entrepreneurs in Brazil who are making a tremendous amount of money and having reach across Latin America in the most exciting ways, who will not go to a movie without an armed guard when they go, okay? So this is the worlds that we live in, I think, particularly in emerging growth markets, and the Middle East is no different than this. Egypt and Syria, of course, are very, very different, because fundamentally the regime, who we will remember, there were a lot of folks there, and I can tell you a lot of people on the ground, young people on the ground, who really thought that Bashar might make a choice to be, quote unquote, a reformer. And I can remember being in Damascus. I was in Damascus the day that Ben Ali fell. It was quite a remarkable time to be there. And people were saying this is going to be an opportunity. They will rise to this. Facebook was illegal, but I saw Facebook everywhere. Damascus was on the rise. It was this amazing collection of very innovative, very artistic entrepreneurs. And of course, the regime made a 20th century command and control decision as opposed to trying to figure whether they could embrace this. And the story in that has been that it's been, while shut down in many cases in Syria, first of all, up until about 6 months ago, I knew entrepreneurs who were still there, still hacking code and sneaking over the border to go to board meetings in Lebanon to stay engaged with some of the great entrepreneurs in Beirut. So this level of tenacity and desire to make this happen is incredible. If you go now to the areas of Lebanon and even Dubai, there are literally thousands of entrepreneurs who are waiting to get back, and they're building and doing things in the meantime. But it's a obviously big wait and see. Egypt is an amazing situation, because I would have told you that it is one of the really great gravitational forces of the Middle East for this phenomenon. Amman, I think, has tremendous opportunity, not just because of the talent there, but because the King of Jordan, I think, has put, for the most part, some very good support behind it. The Emirates are fascinating to watch on this. I mean, Dubai is an expensive place to live, but the opportunity that is what's being developed there and things like e-commerce are great. But Egypt was right in there, and the talent, as you suggested, was incredible. Things happened this summer, and even for maybe a week or so, there was some optimism about the most hard-nosed business people that this will allow us to get back and to do things more focusedly. And then literally I started getting stories from the companies saying, I can't even get across town through the barricades to get a contract signed. So it wasn't even just the sort of obvious, unease. They were sort of fine with that. They could deal with that. But just the basic logistics of getting things done, has been a real problem. And I think the jury's still out on this, because the generations that we see in places like the Arab world that are doing what they're doing are so talented at making such an impact, using technology in very new ways, but they're also the most mobile generation in the history of man. And at some point, great talent will move. And I think this is one of the things that worries me as I think about those two countries. But again, what I'm seeing elsewhere in the region is profound, and most of the great Egyptian entrepreneurs I'm in touch with are still guns blazing.
I find it fascinating that the military coup, let's call it that, nominally to restore order and seemingly backed by the Egyptian middle class, by your account, has made business not easier but more difficult.
It's hard to tell. It's just, there's a lot of wait and see. The logistics of moving across the city are not as bad as they were 2 months ago and all, but there's sort of overhang of what comes next. And when, forgive me for having a moment, but the wonderful guy is the John Stewart of the Middle East.
Yes.
Bassem Youssef, thank you. When all of a sudden it looks like he's getting called in again, all this stuff is unbelievably chilling. There's just no question about it.
Let me ask you to step back a bit and look at the broader question of the extent to which technology really is playing a positive, transforming role in the economy of the Middle East. Certainly everybody has got a smartphone.
Dumb phone, regular phone.
Well, a phone.
Yeah.
But I'm curious whether you think there's a kind of rolling set of business opportunities that technology is creating there that will end up producing broad, deep economic development, or whether there's really, it's more a kind of skimming the cream kind of economy.
Yeah, it's, I mean, in some respects the jury's still out, except I don't think it is. I think this is not a skimming of the cream at all. And in fact, the distinction between dumb phones and smartphones is a deep and profound one, because while to my Kenya example, there are amazing things you can do with texting capability, when you're dealing with a smartphone, you're dealing with a completely new kettle of fish. And I think we in America miss this a lot. I can tell you that I don't know how many of you use BlackBerries, but I will assure you that when the book is written on RIM, what I'm about to describe is going to be at the essence of its demise, which is that they fundamentally thought that a smartphone is a better feature phone. It's a better phone. And I think that was a terrible misjudgment on their part, because a smartphone is a better phone, and a smartphone is a great entertainment vehicle. You can watch video. But you really have to stop and remember that literally in my hand right now is the same computing capacity that put a man on the moon. And as everyone in the mobile world told me, that, I mean, senior executives, that they think within now 2 years, maybe still 3 years, Egypt will have 50% smartphone penetration. The Gulf has above that now, as much as 60% in some countries. Mark Andreessen, who invented Netscape, wrote the foreword of my book, believes that there are going to be 5 billion smartphones on the planet within the next 8 to 10 years. You're talking about half to 2/3 of humanity walking around with supercomputing capacity on their pockets. And the ability to see the way the rest of the world lives, the ability to collaborate very quickly and easily, to innovate very quickly and easily, to develop, and I mean really stop and think about this, because it's a huge point. The ability to have essentially all of the world's knowledge at your fingertips, essentially for free, opens up a wide array of innovation and problem solving bottom up, which is not anything that we've seen before. So how does that really translate, I think, at the end of the day in terms of what its ramifications could be, not guaranteed, but could be in society? I've not talked to an economist in the interviews for the book, and certainly no government World Bank types, who have explained to me how the huge youth bubble in the Middle East could possibly be absorbed by traditional means. Just can't, mathematically, it cannot be done. And so all of a sudden you say to yourself that the Middle East, where in many countries you have as much as 50 or 60% of the population under the ages of 35 to 28, depending what study that you use. I mean, in some respects that's good news, right? I mean, it's better news than Japan's problem, which is a rapidly aging population. But if it's unemployed, you got a terrible issue. So the potential in folks who are actually using these devices, even at small scale, to effectively create jobs and economic opportunity, I think is a very profound one. Education in the Middle East is, as many people know, really terrible, right? Though it surprised me to learn in my research that on a per capita basis, there's actually more spent in education in many parts of the Middle East. You know, I'm treating the region as a blanket, which is a terrible gringo thing to do, so bear with me on that. But it is true, as compared to even Southeast Asia. And to put it in perspective, in Cairo, I think alone, tutoring, supplemental education is a $2 to $3 billion business. And so what does that tell you? That tells you that the schools are lousy, and it tells you that the rich people are taking care of themselves. And lo and behold, out of a place like Flat Six Labs, there's this new company called NAFHAM, which was launched 6 months ago, which now has 10,000 Arabic basic education videos loaded on it, mathematics, reading and writing, available both on dumb and on smartphones, reaching millions of people who've already used some of the supplemental education that are on it. And that was just simply not available to us 5 or 10 years ago. But what that means, it's not just the rich people taking care of themselves and tutoring. That means anybody who's got access to some form of technology has an opportunity to hack in, as the young people will say to me, in ways that were not available. Whether it's enough to have the full-fledged opportunity, you know, that counterbalances the negative forces, I don't have a crystal ball. But what I can say is that there's going to be something available to us in the next 5 years that simply was not available to us all 5 years ago.
So I wonder if one interesting business opportunity is the flip side of the disintegration of the tightly centralized state apparatuses of the region. A friend at the Pentagon sent me today a tragic summary of their current thinking about the dimensions of the humanitarian crisis that's ahead in Syria as the winter comes and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are exposed to the elements. And he noted in addition to that, that school has essentially collapsed. The education of young people in Syria has stopped. And so you're in danger of having a lost generation, in his phrase, of Syrians, breeding ground for all sorts of things, despair, terrorism, take your pick. You've had similar obvious state breakdown in Iraq. State breakdown may be ahead in Egypt, it's hard to say. And I'm just wondering, in this world where the tight central control, as you put it, I've never heard this phrase, the 20th century command and control structures, as they move away, do you think there are business opportunities for flatter, more direct education, other provision of services, provision of what we nominally would think of as government services?
Yeah, and I actually think that's a phenomenon here. I mean, just as a quick aside to underscore the two sides of the world. I mean, Iraq is in a very difficult situation right now, both infrastructurally and politically. It's had a very tough summer, as you know and have seen and all. Iraq is also the country that had the largest, or one of the largest, tech IPOs in the last year. AsiaCell, which is the mobile provider for Iraq, went public for over $5 billion, and the prices continues to rise in the midst of this overall. So we're back in the two-side worlds. But I think you're touching on something which is happening here. In fact, a couple of us were talking about it outside, which is as these big, large, top-down institutions fail, you really see a movement of young people like the NAFAM situation, which, by the way, is in the process of launching a Syria version of it. That's going to be the next thing that is rolling out right now. And part of this because people know that they simply can't wait for other people to come up and figure out the system. And so we're in this very interesting period, not just in the Middle East, but I think around the world, where the new generation looks at infrastructure problems, where people like me and older sort of say, well, that's going to take a generation to fix. And the young people say, what do you mean it takes I am the generation. You're writing me off. And so they actually look at infrastructure problems as software problems. And the education's the most obvious and the largest scale opportunity. But many of you have been to Cairo much often than I have. Traffic is unnavigatable. Traffic clearly will need some top-down work at some point to fix the roads. The new generation says that's well and good. In the meantime, I'm going to launch a series of crowd-sharing apps like Abolic, which has 2 million or 3 million people on it, who are constantly saying what is the best route to get home at any given time. So there's an infrastructure problem there, but they're hacking around it by building a solution that software allows that was not powerful overall. I did not know this, and many of you probably did know this, but the largest collection of fresh water on Earth is in an aquifer under Egypt and Libya. And the biggest issue to access that water is technology. It's just how can you get it? For the most part, you access it through diesel pumping, which was, one, highly unreliable in its delivery, and secondly, was almost completely subsidized. Well, a year ago or so, the subsidies were lifted, so the cost variable are not there. And the delivery issues remain an issue. So what do entrepreneurs say? Well, entrepreneurs say, I'm not going to do some big multi-$100 million government program of solar energy, but I'm going to develop, like this company in Egypt called Carm Solar does, a very simple, very light, maybe $40,000-esque pumping capability powered by solar energy. And the young entrepreneur there, and God bless him, he thinks he can expand arable land in Egypt by 25% by going literally farm by farm as opposed to big macro projects, and that the cost return on it is crystal clear as numbers. I mean, if he's a fifth right, what an amazing ramification that has, both in terms of the business and in terms of the ramifications on its society.
For any venture capitalists in the audience, you're lucky, and we should give you what journalists call a filing break, so you can go out and call somebody with these ideas. I want to ask you about one more unlikely profiting from adversity opportunity. You and I haven't talked about this, so I'm especially curious about your thoughts. As the Edward Snowden revelations just keep rolling forward, we're seeing increasing responses, especially from European companies and countries, saying that we just aren't going to trust our data with American cloud service providers. I wrote a couple months ago, did Edward Snowden kill the cloud? Well, I don't think he killed the cloud, but he may have hurt the ability of American companies to provide those services. So in a post-Snowden world, which is what we're living in, I mean, this really is one of the biggest things that's happened, I think, in the last decade. In a post-Snowden world, as governments in the Arab world look to this future of technology and data provision, data storage, data build-out. Do you think there are new business opportunities both indigenously for companies in the Arab world that say, let us take care of your data, let us hold it. You can't trust anybody else to. We'll build in the protections. And do you think that it's also an opportunity for European companies to jump into what otherwise might have been American technology-related markets?
I think particularly in the Snowden situation, the jury's still out on what the Europeans and other people do and don't do as well. I think in some respects what it's opened up, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot more things coming out, but what it's just opened up is a general skepticism about, what it is government's playing in a role. I think at the end of the day that to the degree people find the costs and convenience of data storage as powerful as that most of us do, betting on Amazon and Google is still a pretty good place to be doing it, with other pressures that may be put on the infrastructure to deal with it. But what I think is a very interesting question, and it hasn't happened actually yet. It's happened in hardware, right? Include consumer electronics and in manufacturing mobile devices. Countries that if we were sitting here 20 years ago, we would not have on our radar at all, like Korea, Japan in this instance, and Finland, as huge global players with global brands in those activities, we would not have expected, and yet they happen. This has not yet really happened in software. There have been enormous software companies like Baidu in China or Alibaba, but that's for the Chinese market, right? It's not something that would be adopted elsewhere. I think that when you look at places like the Middle East, there's some really exciting questions about what could come from there in different areas. So for example, when you're dealing with a society that never knew landlines, which is the Arab world, is it not possible that there may be some really interesting innovation coming in mobile use, mobile software, mobile payments, in that kind of a way? And I've seen some really quite remarkable startups that have given me encouragement that that could be a very interesting story that we'll be talking about one day. As I alluded to in the Carm Solar story, there's a lot of sun in the Middle East. And so should we be surprised if there's not some interesting things both in solar power, usage of water, desalinization, for which there's a tremendous amount of education resources, research resources being put through in there. I think that we're going to see things very positive. But the other thing to keep in mind is that as we deal with this story of mass adoption of technology and a mass rise of middle class, these are becoming really big, large markets in and of themselves. So in the last 20 years, we say if you don't make it in America, you really kind of don't make it anywhere in technology. We're a large market, we're technology leaders, this is a place where people want to be. And this is still a place where people want to be. I mean, let me not hit the point too hard. Let us just say this is not the high watermark of the way we're viewed in the Middle East right now. And I get that all the time when I'm over there, except when you talk about Silicon Valley, except when you talk about entrepreneurship and technology, and then there's a real seeking of co-authorship, right? Not just merely we'll be a cheap resource to you, but real co-authorship. So that's a real golden opportunity for us. But the thing that we need to look at cautiously is in the next 10 or 20 years, there are going to be multi-billion-dollar communities outside of the United States with buying power in a middle class that will go its own way. And I think that to the degree that we don't look for opportunities for innovation around the world, to the degrees that we don't think about our engagement as true co-authorship, as opposed to, well, I'll go there because there's a big market cap, me, I'll go there because it's a cheap place to outsource, me, we're going to be sitting on a really missed opportunity, I think, from business to policy across the board.
So let me take that as a starting point for my last question, then I want to turn to the audience for your questions, so please do think of them. Not quite yet, Ode. Because I have one last question, which is the policy side of this. Given the world that you're describing in this book, this world of entrepreneurial talent, early stage technology startups, how can the United States government, putting aside the corporate sector now, most effectively assist this process? And if you would comment, please, specifically on the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, which is in mortal danger as we speak today. An idea that I personally thought had a lot of merit, is about to unravel because of a hold that's been placed on it by a senator. So if you could speak, what do you think the sensible policy options are, first, and second, if you would, comment on that particular idea and what you think about it.
Look, I think the potential is real, except that I've seen so little of it manifested in reality, meaning And this is what I say. A lot of top people in government say, what should we do? And my first line sounds cavalier, but I mean it. Stop talking about it. Stop giving speeches about it at every place. Stop saying it's entrepreneurship. And for God's sake, stop in any speech that you give referring to the greatest export of America being entrepreneur. There's nothing like showing up to a region of 10,000 years of entrepreneurship and the senior person here giving a speech saying, this is the greatest export that there is. I mean, it's just such a ham-fisted, forgive me that analogy, but it's a lousy way to be thinking about stuff. And you can give all the speeches you want, but there's a lot of basic blocking and tackling that can really move things. So government, can play a role in assisting in risk investment, right? I think OPIC is a very successful operation this way, but startups and technology don't need debt financing, they need equity. And most of the organizations here, again, as top-down institutions, have great difficulty finding out efficacious ways of supporting smaller investment coming up, and at the same time how to support equity and equity investors where Westerners could invest in that kind of thing. The visa situation and immigration we could spend another 2 hours on, so I won't spend too much time there. Suffice to say that there was a wonderful Egyptian startup, wonderful. These guys are they could be world class. And they got reached out to by 2 Silicon Valley venture firms in April and invited to come to Silicon Valley to give a pitch. And they said, okay, we'll get our visas, we'll get there. Because they said, no Skype, you got to be here in person, we're talking to other people, be here by June, you got 6 weeks. And they went down to get a visa, and our embassy said, come back in August and we'll give you an interview. Right? Stop talking about it. I mean, if that's these kind of basic blocking and tackles. So that takes us to the Egyptian Enterprise Fund. I mean, if there was ever an idea run by a man who gets bottom up and really gets the sense of co-authorship in emerging markets.
Jim Harmon, who's head of the fund, who used to be head of the Export-Import.
You could not have picked a better person to do this. I mean, not only has he had other experience in the government and different development things, he's been on the ground. He's had to make very tough business decisions and investment decisions in emerging markets. He's like out of central casting for the role of trying to have a truly co-authored venture between Egypt and the United States, and he actually wants to bring in other investors from other parts of the world. It's a fantastic idea that would be a great resource psychologically as much as in reality. And I don't know what to tell you, David. I mean, for it to go down, you really sort of wonder what our strategy is in emerging worlds. You really kind of wonder what capabilities that we have in today's environment just to get some of the basic stuff right.
I wrote a little bit about this online on washingtonpost.com yesterday if you're interested in following up, but I literally mean it. This very good idea that has a lot of Egyptian support and is now poised to make an investment that could provide, I think it would be the largest source of capital for startup firms in Egypt if this investment can be made, is about to die because of a hold that has been put on it to me inexplicably by Senator Lindsey Graham. So with that very political note, I do want to turn to the audience, and I want to, Ode Aberdeen, I've known even longer than I've known Chris Schroeder, which is saying something, had his hand up first, and then we'll turn to others.
Chris, very good analysis.
Thank you.
Ode is there. However, as I have looked at this subject of venture capital.
I'm not sure you're on, sir.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Try again.
Hello?
Oh.
Okay. Anyway,
I'll repeat it if it's...
when I look at the Arabian...
Ode, try the other, see if the other one works.
Okay. Okay. Historically speaking, Arabs have been very good merchants. They love to invest in hotels and real estate.
You have to hold it right now.
Okay. We have tremendous liquidity. I mean, I was telling Alex, people keep talking how the Chinese have $2 trillion in foreign exchange holdings. If you add up the reserves, private and official, of the whole Arab region, you're talking about $2 trillion.
Yeah.
But yet, there's hardly any risk
Right.
capital.
Yeah.
You look at Arab banks, they're very liquid. If an Arab entrepreneur wants to go to any Arab bank in any country, no one is there to provide the seed money. So until the mode of doing business changes, when you have to bet on people with ideas, when you're willing to risk capital, the other problem is there's no regional integration. It's difficult. We have companies that operate in Egypt and we have companies that operate in Jordan, but it's difficult to export. So there has to be regional integration. And lastly, women play an important role. And in today's education, especially in the Gulf, women tend to be better students than men.
No question.
They work harder, but yet they have very limited opportunities.
Yeah.
So for your vision to come about,
So let me tell you why the next 5 years is different than the last 5 years that you just talked about. And you raised, let me make sure I keep track of it, women in the end, money in the beginning, and the second one was integration. So overall, these are unbelievably real problems. A deeply rich guy I know over there says to me, not unlike what you just said, the good news is we have plenty of money. The bad news, it's in our pocket. And if you have pride in showing your friends your latest Four Seasons, to put that kind of capital into a portfolio who by definition 60 or 70% of it will go to zero is a huge psychological barrier to happen. And so this is very real. And in fact, what's interesting in the Middle East, as you know better than I, for some time there has been some tradition of private equity, later stage, profitable, 50, 100 and larger million-dollar businesses. Last 2 or 3 years has been very exciting in angel investment, but very low dollars, 10, 20, 50,000. The real challenge now for these young people that you're describing on the money side are what we in the States call the A round, which is the guys have finally, or the women, have finally succeeded. Now they need $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, and they're having trouble doing it. And it drives them crazy. So when Prince Alawid invests $300 million in Twitter, if you watch Twitter that day, every entrepreneur I know was like, we'll take 10%. Just, where are you? Help, come. So this is a problem. Accept that. The next 5 years. You have amazing figures in business, not only of kind of an older generation like Fatih Gandor and Aramex, who are putting tremendous amount of capital at ways. And I know now of several hundred or multi-hundred million dollar round funds that are being raised in the region. But I think the exciting thing to watch is the first round of wealth then puts it back in. So for example, Sami Tukan, who's an amazing entrepreneur who built the Yahoo of the Middle East called Maktub, which was sold for a little bit under $200 million to Yahoo. He's putting that money back with money from Tiger in a fund called Jabbar Capital. And he has not only funded 24 other startups, but this is where the flywheel becomes very interesting and certainly is a big part of Silicon Valley. Probably 24 also of the entrepreneurs who worked at Maktub are now running their own companies. One of the spin-offs is a company called Souk.com, which is the Amazon, effectively, the Middle East. It's probably a multi-hundred-million-dollar business. It hasn't gone public yet, but it's very interesting. So there are early nascent signs of this, but it's a challenge, and it would be probably cited as maybe the #1 challenge to many of the people that I've talked to there across the border. But we're seeing something interesting happening, which I find encouraging, where I believe success breeds success. A couple more exits brings in more money. This has happened somewhat in Istanbul. And so I think that is something to look for overall. In terms of the motion of moving goods from country to country, it's unbelievable. I mean, literally, people will tell you you can buy something from New York, ship it to Dubai, and send it to Amman faster than you get it from New York to Amman and these kinds of things. As a friend of mine said, imagine trying to build a Souk.com or Amazon.com in the United States of America if all 50 states had their own regulatory bodies, their own investigators, their own things. This is a real millstone. The regulatory environment is a millstone. So what do entrepreneurs do when there's a millstone? They work around it. And so Aramex has announced that it is going to help any startup entrepreneur in e-commerce just to take it from them, minimum cost, and they'll deal with the logistics. Your package may get there a few days later, but we're just going to get through this and we're going to work through this in the meantime. The GCC, interestingly, as you guys know much better than I do, that includes now Morocco and Jordan, is actually having conversations about trying to streamline this stuff. But who knows? I mean, they just had a conversation recently about having a unified visa. Are the Saudis really going to join that? You know, so you don't know. But again, there are things that are in motion that would not have been in motion going forward with new generation people doing it. I think women is the most exciting, disbelieved story of the Middle East. The Economist said this summer, I don't know where they got the data, but I can tell you that my anecdotes support it completely, that 1/3 of the tech entrepreneurs are women. And I can tell you I was a judge at a startup competition that MIT's Arab operation holds every year 2 years ago in Beirut, and it was 1,500 entrepreneurs, 6,000 companies. 41% were women. Now you try going to a Silicon Valley gathering of any nature and finding half that. You're going to gatherings I don't go to. And I think this is one of the big untapped secret stories. I have a chapter on women in the book. It was so interesting when I interviewed women. A chunk of them said, do not call me a woman entrepreneur. I'm so sick of you gringos coming over here, so impressed with what we take for granted. Talk about my company, but I don't want to hear about this. Other women, you know, were saying, look, of course it's been tough. Saudi Arabia is a great opportunity for us, but we can't drive. Venture capitals treat us terribly. I still have to deal with my family. No one else, it's real too. But what unified their reaction was a sense of what's the definition of entrepreneurship? It's working around stuff. And we're really, really good at working around stuff.
Chris, tell the audience the story of the Lebanese woman who came up with her version of the Google glasses for swimming. This is great.
She's just great.
You're going to want
she's just
to
great.
say, how do I invest in this person?
She's utterly investable. I mean, Hind Hobaika, who was a great swimmer at college in Beirut, and it drove her crazy that the only training devices that you had to measure pulse rate and heart rate were fundamentally, which is still true in the States, were fundamentally adaptations for runners. And so they'd be made waterproof and they could work more efficaciously and so on. But if you're doing this, it's kind of hard to look at your... So she developed these very lightweight goggles that does your pulse rate and your breath rate through your temple. And it is a Google Glass. I've used them. It's a Google Glass-like experience. You just look up there and your numbers are there as you're swimming. You can look at them at any time, and she's going to add other things. But it's a beautiful story of the time because it's a local entrepreneur with a lot of local talent. They've outsourced the manufacturing to Asia, and they're about to launch in the West and anywhere else where they can launch, hopefully this fall, if not early winter. And it's marvelous, absolutely marvelous. Oh, here's another funny story. So it goes back to the money in a way. So she raised a very good angel round. I can't remember what she raised, might have been 100 grand or whatever. But she needed more to get to the next round, but wasn't convinced she wanted to take a multi-million-dollar thing. She just needed a little bit more. So what does she do? She puts her goggles, Instabeat it's called, they put their goggles on Indiegogo or Kickstarter, which is one of these crowdfunding platforms, and you could you'd be the first to get a goggle if you fund on this. And she just wanted to raise like another $35,000. That's the scale of what we're talking about. And like within a week, she had $85,000 raised. And so all people she'd never known, all done online, all on a platform.
I love that story. Yes.
Yes. Ray Tanter, Chris, I want to take off on what you said about the role of women and tie that to the growing role of the Islamists. And I don't think the two things go together very well. I was at the Maliki event this morning at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he was saying that the big problem in Iraq right now is al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And he didn't say anything about the Sunni-Shia split or anything like that. And the question I have is that when Ennahda came into Tunisia and Ben Ali fell, women were not disenfranchised, but this was a setback for the women. When the Muslim Brotherhood came into Egypt, it became a setback for women. How do you see and I think the Islamists now are on the run, which is a good thing in terms of, I think, entrepreneurship. But if the Islamists come back, then I think there's trouble. Israel is a fascinating case of a startup nation. And women do very well there. And the Orthodox Jewish community doesn't have a big role on such things as entrepreneurship. They have a big role in politics because the parties are split so evenly. So the question I have, I said that twice now, I really will sit down in a second.
That's right.
Is if there were an increase in the role of Islamists, how would that have an impact on countries like Dubai, for example, or countries like Egypt?
I'm not an expert in this subject, and I have my own, views about what it could mean or not mean, but no real view about who's winning or losing or how even to phrase that oversimplistic question, my question, not yours. But I did write a chapter in the book about religion in the ecosystem. And interestingly, there were people that did not want me to do it. And the reason why, because I'm no theologian and I've got my own issues with my own faith, right? But the reason why I did it was because every time I came back from the region and I talked to Americans, well-traveled Americans, they always asked me about religion in the ecosystem, always. Whereas if I come back from Indonesia, which is one of the world's largest Islamic countries, if not the largest. Is it the largest? The largest. No one ever asks. I come back from Israel, no one ever asks. I come back from India, no one ever, and this never comes up. But I come back from the Arab world, and it comes up all the time. And I said to myself, on that alone, I'm going to have to address this issue, if nothing else, to check our own biases on why that phenomenon might be true. So what I did was I interviewed and let the entrepreneurs speak for themselves. I simply asked a basic question, which was not far off from your question, which is, I can't get involved in the theology of this, but I am curious about what religion means to you in your life, and I am curious about this, which is, religion or otherwise, if, in fact, You live in a country that expects lockstep adherence to hierarchy and puts half of its talent at bay. How will that society compete in a global economy that's different? Because if the internet is anything else, it is about anti-hierarchy and everything about the best possible talent that can come bring to bear. And I think it's actually one of the most important chapters of the book, because it opened up this amazing outpouring, very emotional, passionate about how faith is so important to these entrepreneurs and what they do in ways that it is for many people, that at the end of the day, that there's so much in Islam that is completely compatible with what it means to be a great entrepreneur. That one of the Prophet's wives, of course, was a great merchant and so on. I heard that often from people. But that they believed that it was not a hierarchical thing. That at the end of the day, there are no popes, they kept saying to me. And so that if they're in a society where this is a problem, it's going to be a problem. But they're not convinced that the same political voice that's coming out with technology, the same societal voice coming out with technology, the economic voice that's coming out with technology, is allowing interesting debate about culture and faith that has not also been available before. And they were, for the most part, quite hopeful. I was very impressed by that, very moved by it.
Ray's question, I think, is a really important one because it raises the issue of tolerance. And I think you can have societies that are deeply religious but are also tolerant of other religions.
Absolutely.
My friend Hisham Melhem, who perhaps some of you know, was the Al Arabiya bureau chief here and a columnist for An-Nahar, wrote a beautiful column for An-Nahar, which he translated for me, about a visit he took to Cordoba in the Arab dream of Andalusia, the great summit of Arab culture when Arab culture dominated Europe that was in the Dark Ages. And the point of his column was this was a culture of tolerance, that it was Muslims rose to a level that they hadn't seen before, but so did Jews, so did Christians. It was a place where everybody got smarter and richer together. So I always think of Hisham's wise column on that. Do we have other questions, please? Yes. Yes, you, and then the
Yes,
gentleman back.
by the way, congratulations on Startup Rising, excellent.
Thank you.
But I'd like to look at the other side of the coin. My name is Sam Knackley. We specialize in developing hospitals in the Middle East. And what we see is as countries become industrialized, like China, cancer develops, pollution develops. So what's going to happen in the Middle East is the same thing. You're going to have there's going to be peace in the Middle East, hopefully, Palestine and Israel. Then we're going to have tremendous amount of investments from the Gulf areas into Egypt and other countries. And then we're going to have a significant amount of pollution control problems, environmental problems, and cancer and all that. So do you see any biotechnology startups? Do you see any ecological startups? Or is that something that we're going to look in the next 10 years?
No, as I alluded to before, I think it's true, but of course it's also true here and elsewhere. Diabetes, as you know, in the Middle East is an enormous problem, but therefore there are entrepreneurs who are coming up with really interesting devices to help people manage diabetes. And one of the things that happens, particularly in health, where in many parts of the Middle East, people are reticent to talk about aspects. Of course, the technology allows people to have open conversations, even anonymously, in terms of sharing ideas, which are very powerful, which is unlike the company that I ran before. As I said, solar-powered and green companies I see everywhere, and this is a very big part of the way people are doing it. Really, the question to keep coming at, and again, I don't judge it as one will counteract the other. I will only talk in a hopeful view that things are available to us that were not there before. That most of the problems that you talked about, there are actually technological solutions towards. And what is so beautiful is that not just in the Middle East, but with a particular amazement in the Middle East, the greatest entrepreneurs really are problem solvers. And they're looking at infrastructure problems and problems in health and problems in traffic and problems in pollution and saying, all right, now how am I going to fix that? And I'm going to fix it. Because when other people say it's going to take a generation, they're done. They just don't talk about it anymore. So I'm actually very hopeful in those. I think what I hear when you talk is an unbelievable opportunity.
I'm tempted to say those problems of overconsumption, consequences of rapid economic development, it'd be nice to be worrying about those problems as opposed to the ones that we have now. But yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Jamie McAuliffe with Education for Employment. We put young people to work in their first jobs in the Middle East and North Africa and work with many of the companies that you profile in the book. And one of the biggest questions I get, and I know Fadi Gandour and many of the people who are involved in this work in the Middle East are frustrated by, is the fragmentation and the small, successful profiles of companies and nonprofits that are working at this issue, that are doing great work, but still at a very small scale. So that critical question of how do you scale this up? How do you scale up these ecosystems in the Middle East to support many more young entrepreneurs and get behind the most successful companies to help them grow even more quickly, to hire more people? Do you have a sense of what it would take to really scale up these efforts across the region?
Sure, and I mean, some of it's been tried and true in other industries overall. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of work, but it's not rocket science, right? It goes back to the ability not to move goods and services very easily. You know, that's a problem. I mean, to be able to allow and to have policies that are allowed a focus on anything that can alleviate burden on the movement of people, ideas, and is really, you know, a tremendous shift of it overall. Now, Fadi would tell you, and others would tell you, there's still cultural adoptions. I mean, corporate social responsibility is a relatively new phenomenon here. There are lots of businesses that don't look at it as something that they could get involved in the same way, but I think newer businesses are thinking in different ways. So some of it, I think, is generational as well. There's a great enterprise that I'm sure you worked with, and I was talking to this other gentleman about before, called Injaz Al Arab, which does education training across the Arab world in entrepreneurship. And I don't know, you may remember, I think they've had over 2 million students go through it by now. It's like junior achievement. It's good. Yeah, it's exactly like that. But it's amazing. These classes, I've been to these classes, and they're unbelievable. And the kids feel great, and they have another view of the future. You know, 2 million kids is pretty scaled. So I mean, it's out there. It's time, dedication, and a commitment that these are real ideas.
Ted?
Maybe 2 more.
Yeah, Chris, you alluded.
Hold on a sec, Ted, for Mike.
My voice doesn't require it. You alluded to a big problem in the Arab world, and particularly in the Gulf, and that's the public education system. It's failing the whole generation. I think education's gone backwards in many ways in the Arab world. In fairness, as you say, in the Gulf particularly, there's a lot of inputs, but no outputs commensurate with the inputs. And for instance, and I don't want to pick on countries, but I can think right off the top of my head of 3 Gulf countries that when they take the international, I think it's called TIMSS, the International Measure of Math and Science.
Yeah.
4th and 8th graders take this test. And it's an international test. And to their credit, a number of Arab countries participate. But 3 Gulf countries pretty much bring up the rear in terms of the test scores. And not one Arab country finishes at the 50th percentile. They're all below. So I was very interested in what you said about workarounds and trying to put things online that, you know, where students would have access to at least people who really know their subject matter and can teach it. I had a son at college who couldn't understand 2 foreign professors. He was taking Calculus 1, Calculus 2, couldn't understand hardly a word, which is, you know, we're all from immigrant backgrounds, so we all respect that. These are brilliant people. They just, he went online to MIT's course, right, and got it. But I don't know if there's any more you can add to.
I just think that, well, a couple things. I think we're in the earliest innings of what's becoming available, both technologically and the multiplier effect that it has of people who use things. And if the founder of NAFHAM were here, he would tell you that not only are people accessing directly technology, but mothers are bringing kids together in their houses to go use it together as a group. And so you see very interesting things, and it's a real serious challenge. Now, obviously, the Gulf is spending some real money at upper education and research to try to attract institutions from around the world to do there. It's an interesting approach. We'll have to see whether some of the top-down efforts come at it, but it could not be a more serious generational problem. But again, we have tools that are availability that simply were not there 5 years ago. So this isn't the answer.
Yes, please.
In many of these Middle Eastern countries.
Hold on 1 sec, because I want to make sure everybody can hear the question.
Can you hear that? Oh, good. Okay, great. In many of these Middle Eastern countries, the population of foreign inhabitants is greater than the actual local population. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all of
Dubai.
this, Dubai. And these folks, while often living there for an entire generation or more, have few rights in terms of citizenship, property, ownership, and so forth. Have you seen in your travels any effort to incorporate these folks into the ecosystem?
I have not. No, I have not.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Rhonda Fahmy, UDOME. I do a lot of work in the Palestinian private sector, and I'm wondering if you interviewed anybody in the Palestinian private sector. There's such great capacity for what they're doing now in the high-tech world. As you may have known, there was a young Palestinian man recently who hacked into Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook page
Right.
to tell him something. High unemployment. There's great need for it. Places like Bethlehem, where Muslims and Christians have lived for centuries together. There's a lot of potential there, but the highest unemployment rate in the West Bank. And so I'm wondering if you had any interviews there, or what, what, if anything, your book
absolutely.
says.
So there's this thing called Startup Weekend, which is a program that was developed in the United States, and it's sort of a franchise, but it's an education program where young people can gather in any city. There can be a startup weekend anywhere if there's a leader within the city who wants to make it happen. And then no one comes with a business. All the young people gather and they break out in groups and they form businesses together and they pitch ideas and they learn a lot of the basics, and there have been extremely well-funded companies around the world. There have been a bunch of those that have happened in Ramallah and East Jerusalem and Nazareth. But the last one to happen was in Gaza. 250 young entrepreneurs showed up, and some incubators from Jordan and other worlds came and did the tutoring and helped put on the program and all. And it just was fantastic. And so what's happening even in the most isolated locations when there is access to technology is a mind blow. And some of the most gifted entrepreneurs that I met are in Ramallah and East Jerusalem. There's a great company there that could very well become the Expedia of the Middle East that raised $1 million in Ramallah. So it's tremendously difficult what they wrestle there, but again, in difficulty and necessity, some interesting things happen.
Chris, just to follow up, and then people who want to know, I mean, you said so many interesting things, so many data points just in our discussion here. People who want to follow up beyond reading your book, is there a website that you would send them to, a sort of central aggregator of information about the startup community in the region?
There are a lot, and there are a lot of really interesting things that are happening this week. Probably the easiest one to start with is wamda.com, W-A-M-D-A, which is a little bit like TechCrunch. I mean, it's all the breaking news. They've got a lot of content, people covering stories, and it's got some great history, great aggregation. They have tutoring courses. They have videos of some of the small gatherings and large gatherings that they've put together. It's a fantastic one-stop shop, but you'll find almost everyone who participates there has got a great blog, and you can go in different directions. There's a couple of institutions that have been doing some really first and good data gathering for the first time, and one is under relatively new leadership who's revolutionizing the place called Silatech, and there's some S-I-L-A-T-E-C-H, and they're starting to put some really interesting reports online of this. And then Booz & Company, with their operations out of Dubai and Lebanon, they've been doing partnerships and research with Google and have amazing reports about women, about startups, about technology usage, really across the spectrum. And if you started with those three in my book, you're in pretty good shape to start, and there are many others I could send you to thereafter.
Yes, please.
Karen DeMars, the State Department. And so thank you for going on 2 delegations with our State Department. And it surprises me that you don't give the State Department any credit for introducing you to the area, because I think that those 2 delegations might have been the first time that you were introduced to those startups. Maybe not, but also we don't have much funding, but then there are things like Global Innovation, Science and Technology that funded InstaBeat in its first round, for example. And so if you could talk more about how we could do better and what other things that we could do, like those delegations, that might help expose more Americans to the startup scene in the Middle East and North Africa, that would be very helpful.
So just to be clear, the State Department was not my introduction to the region by any stretch of the imagination, but it was and I want to come back to this because it's important. I think down in the grassroots level of the State Department and efforts on the ground, bottom up, that are USAID, for example, and consultants of USAID. There's an amazing guy in Egypt who's now back in the States named Mike Ducker, whose name comes up all the time when I interview people there. But I think that you said something almost parenthetically. I'll put in perspective. I got invited to one of your gatherings to be a judge at a startup competition. At the end of the phone call, I was asked if I would not only be willing to pay my own way, but would I contribute to the award that was being given at the end. And so you guys who are doing, in my view, God's work, goes back to my bigger point, that if they can't get right a sense of priorities in offices like yours and get the right amount of funding to you to be able to execute on some of these programs, then you're succeeding despite yourself, but with the headwinds that you don't need to do. I made a very conscious decision in writing the book, and in the acknowledgments I actually talk a lot about some amazing people like Steve Coltai and Shelley Porges and the GIST program and PNB. But I made a decision in the book not to write about America at all. It was just a cutting point. And I acknowledge heroes and women and men who are doing amazing things like what you say and need much, much more support. But this is not about us. This is about what's happening on the ground. And I think once we have that introduction and a ground where people understand that these things are happening and opportunities are there, it helps folks above you, candidly, to say, all right, what is our strategy? How can we engage in this? Not about me, not about how we're the greatest export to you, but we'll give you incredible runway to be, I think, much more successful at larger scale over time.
With that, I want to leave plenty of time for everybody to go buy Chris's book.
For Rawad.
And to get Chris to sign the book. I want to join all of you, I know, in thanking Chris for just a really, really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for doing it yet again.